5 planets, perfect circular orbits, around the same star. That does not happen naturally. Physicists calculated it thousands of years after the Corellian system was first settled. The gravitational mathematics are simply wrong. You cannot have 5 habitable worlds sitting in those positions around that sun unless something put them there. Not drifted there, not formed there, moved there, deliberately, with precision that no civilization in recorded history has come close to replicating. So the question is not whether someone built the Corellian system. The question is who, and what else did they build, and where did they go? The answer to all 3 questions is the same. And it is the most unsettling thing in the entire history of the Star Wars galaxy. Because the beings who built the Corellian system did not stop there. They built the cluster of black holes near Kessel. They built the hyperspace lanes everyone travels without thinking about. They drew the borders of the galaxy itself. They seeded life on hundreds of worlds, including, in all likelihood, the worlds humans call home. They shaped the Force. They imprisoned a being so dangerous that they constructed a cage out of singularities just to contain her. They did all of this, and then they vanished. Completely, without leaving a single name behind. We call them the Celestials. That name came from civilizations that rose from the dust long after they were gone. Civilizations that found the things these beings had built and stood there in silence, trying to find a word that could contain what they were looking at. Gods felt too presumptuous. Architects implied they were merely engineers, and that was too small. Celestials was the word that stuck. Celestials because whatever they were, they operated at a level that made the most advanced civilizations in later history look like children arranging pebbles in the dirt. Nobody knows their real names. Not one individual Celestial has ever been identified in any surviving record anywhere in the galaxy. Not one name, not one face, not one personal account. Everything we know about them comes second-hand, from ruins, from the memories of species who worked alongside them, from fragments of texts so ancient that the languages they were written in no longer exist. By the time those texts reach us, they may carry only shadows of what they once contained, but those shadows are enough to tell a story. And it is one of the greatest stories in all of this galaxy. This is the entire history of the Celestials, the beings who built everything, the beings nobody remembers. And the reason that, right now, as you listen to this, you are living inside a construction you cannot see. That echo is what we are here to follow. The question of what the Celestials actually were, what they were made of, and how they moved through existence, is one of the oldest and most stubbornly unanswered questions in all of galactic scholarship. The records that survive describe them in ways that seem to contradict each other until you stop expecting them to behave like ordinary beings and start accepting that ordinary categories simply do not apply. Some accounts say the Celestials could change their shape at will, that they had no fixed physical form and instead shifted into whatever appearance suited the moment or the work at hand. Other accounts describe them as beings of living energy, not flesh in any conventional sense, but something more like concentrated force itself, given will and direction and intent. Still, other fragments suggest they began as regular biological creatures somewhere in the ancient past, beings with bodies and homeworlds and histories who evolved over such incomprehensible spans of time that they transcended the physical entirely and became something that no category of later science could adequately name or describe. The truth may be that all of these accounts are partially right. The Celestials may have been beings who had evolved so far beyond their origins that describing them in physical terms had become meaningless, the way you cannot meaningfully describe a symphony by talking about the wood the instruments are carved from. The wood is real. The wood matters. But it is not the point. The Celestials were something like that. Whatever physical form or substrate they once had was simply not the most significant thing about them by the time the galaxy knew them. What mattered was their relationship with the Force. Every account, every fragment, every piece of indirect evidence agrees on this. The Celestials and the Force were connected in a way that no later beings have matched or even fully understood. Not the Sith at their most powerful. Not the greatest Jedi Masters who ever lived. Not even the beings who would eventually emerge from the Force itself and be called the Ones. Though those are a separate and extraordinary story that comes a little later. The Celestials understood the Force on a level that was qualitatively different from anything that came after them. They did not merely use the Force the way a Jedi uses it, reaching for it as a tool, drawing it toward themselves for strength or guidance. They did not channel it through emotion or discipline or surrender the way later traditions would teach. They operated within it the way a river operates within its own banks, shaping and being shaped simultaneously, moving through it as naturally and completely as breathing. Later Jedi who studied their works described looking at celestial constructions and sensing in the Force a kind of signature, so deep and so complex and so ancient that it was like trying to read a text written in a language you had never seen before. You could feel that meaning was there. You could feel the depth and the intention and the care behind it, but you could not quite reach it. There was always another layer beneath whatever you managed to understand. This was the kind of being that built the galaxy we know. Before the Celestials turned their attention to it in earnest, the galaxy was a different place. Not necessarily worse or better, simply unorganized in the ways that would later matter enormously. Star systems existed wherever the physics of stellar formation had placed them over billions of years. Species evolved on whatever worlds. Their particular combination of conditions permitted life to take hold. Hyperspace routes formed or did not form according to natural principles that had nothing to do with the needs of intelligent civilizations. The galaxy functioned. In other words, the way a vast old wilderness functions before anyone arrives with a plan for it. Life everywhere, complexity and abundance and strangeness in every direction, but no architecture beneath it. No intention behind the placement of things. No consciousness that had decided this cluster of worlds needed to be seeded with intelligent species who could build something together, or that this gravitational anomaly needed to be reshaped into something useful, or that this entire edge of the galaxy needed to be made deliberately difficult to navigate in order to protect everything inside it from what existed on the other side. The Celestials changed all of that. They changed it so completely and so thoroughly that by the time later civilizations rose and looked at the galaxy around them, they had no way of knowing how much of what they took to be natural had in fact been built. They did not know the hyperspace lanes they traveled had been shaped. They did not know the star systems they lived in had been arranged. They did not know the borders of their galaxy had been deliberately drawn. They lived inside a construction without knowing it was a construction, the way someone born inside a very old and very beautiful house might live their whole life without thinking about the hands that laid the foundation, The Celestials' first great projects were the most fundamental. They began with the structure of the galaxy itself, the hyperspace lanes that would one day allow civilization to spread and commerce to flow and armies to march and knowledge to travel between the stars. They did not merely discover these routes and map them the way later explorers mapped the lanes they found. They shaped them. They altered the gravitational relationships between star systems across enormous distances and in ways that created the pathways that later navigators would follow for tens of thousands of years, believing they had simply found what nature had put there. Some of what they created worked with existing gravitational forces rather than against them. But the overall pattern, the fundamental web of connections that would allow a galactic republic to function, bore celestial fingerprints all the way through. It was designed. It was intended. Every major corridor of travel through the galaxy reflected choices that the Celestials had made. Then came Centerpoint Station. Of all the things the Celestials built, Centerpoint Station is the one that later civilizations most clearly and most immediately recognized as something no natural process could have produced. It is also the thing that most powerfully demonstrates what the Celestials were capable of when they were working at the height of their power and knowledge. Centerpoint Station sat in the Corellian system, positioned between the planet Talus and the planet Trallus, precisely at the gravitational midpoint, where the pull of both worlds cancelled each other out perfectly. It was a hollow sphere. The word enormous does not come close to capturing it. The interior of Centerpoint Station was large enough to contain a small world of its own, or to house hundreds of millions of beings with space remaining. It had been there so long by the time later civilizations discovered it that nobody could determine with any confidence exactly when it had been built. The best estimates placed its construction somewhere between 100,000 and 1 million years before the founding of the Galactic Republic. Estimates, because there was no instrument and no technique available to any civilization that had come since, that could be more precise than a range that wide. What Centerpoint Station could do was the thing that defied easy comprehension by any mind trained to think about physics in normal terms. It could reach out through hyperspace and grab celestial bodies, planets, moons, objects of any size at all. And it could move them, not push them slowly over centuries through some conventional form of propulsion. It could grab them, as if the mass of a world weighed no more than a stone in the hand, drag them through hyperspace to wherever they needed to go, and position them with exact precision wherever the operator wanted them. The range of this ability was essentially unlimited by anything the engineers who later studied the station could measure or calculate. The station could do this to any object anywhere in the reachable galaxy. The Celestials built Centerpoint Station specifically to build the Corellian system. This is worth sitting with for a moment. The Corellian system, the star system, that would eventually become one of the most important in all of galactic history, a system that would produce some of the finest pilots and the most resourceful navigators and the most storied heroes and scoundrels the galaxy had ever seen. A system that would be home to a world present at the founding of the Galactic Republic did not exist naturally. Every single world in the Corellian system sits in a perfect circular orbit around its star. 5 habitable planets, all arranged with a mathematical precision that physicists in later eras calculated simply cannot occur through natural orbital mechanics. The gravitational forces involved in naturally forming a system like that are wrong. They do not work that way. Something had to put those planets where they are and hold them there. The Celestials put them there. They used Centerpoint Station as their primary instrument, reaching across the galaxy and pulling worlds from wherever they originally existed, and dragging them through hyperspace into the orbits the Celestials had selected for them. Each of those 5 planets had been somewhere else before the Celestials decided to build the Corellian system. They became inhabitants of a new sun as part of a cosmic engineering project so ancient that by the time humans were living on those worlds and calling them home, the history of how those worlds had come to be there had passed entirely out of memory and knowledge. The people of Corellia knew their world was old. They did not know their world had been moved there. They did not know they were living on a construction. Beneath each of those worlds, the Celestials had buried something else as well. Planetary repulsors, massive machines installed deep within each planet, at a level below any ordinary excavation or drilling operation could ever reach, machines that interacted with Centerpoint Station and with each other in ways that later engineers could observe working without fully understanding the principles behind them. These planetary repulsors could be activated as weapons of almost inconceivable destructive power if the right knowledge and the right access codes were available. The Celestials had built weapons into the architecture of an entire star system, buried them in the cores of planets where they would wait, maintained by nothing for as long as it took. Why they did this, whether it was a defense mechanism or a contingency plan, or simply a necessary consequence of the physics by which Centerpoint Station operated, nobody in later ages could determine with confidence. What they could determine was that these planetary repulsors were still there, still buried, still functional, tens of thousands of years after the Celestials had vanished from the galaxy entirely. The Celestials built other things with Centerpoint Station and with the knowledge they carried. The Hapes Cluster, a dense and unusual grouping of stars in the inner galaxy, bears the marks of deliberate celestial arrangement in its stellar configuration. The Cathol, the Volta system, each of these required manipulating gravity on scales that challenged any framework later physics could offer. Each of them sat where it sat, shaped the way it was shaped, because the Celestials had decided it should be that way for reasons that died with them. But perhaps the most extraordinary thing the Celestials ever built, the one that speaks most directly to the nature of the beings who built it and the seriousness of the problems they were trying to solve, was the Maw. The Maw is a cluster of black holes. Not one black hole sitting alone in space. Not 2 or 3 that happen to exist in natural proximity to each other over billions of years of stellar evolution. A cluster positioned near the planet Kessel, chained together in deliberate and careful formation, like pieces arranged on a board by someone who understood all the rules of the game and was thinking several moves ahead of anyone else alive. Black holes are the most extreme objects the universe produces. They are places where the fabric of space-time curves so severely that the laws of physics, as ordinary beings understand them, cease to function in familiar ways. Where gravity becomes so absolute that not even light can achieve escape velocity. Where anything that crosses the threshold of the event horizon is gone, in any conventional sense, forever. The Celestials grabbed them. Multiple black holes, pulled from wherever they existed across the galaxy, and positioned them in careful, deliberate formation near Kessel. They turned the most destructive objects in the universe into construction materials. They used singularities as building blocks. The reason they did this, the purpose behind the Maw, is one of the most important and most consequential facts in the entire history of the Celestials, and it connects directly to events that were happening within the celestial world itself at the time. The Maw was a prison. The Celestials needed somewhere to contain something that could not be allowed to exist freely in the galaxy. Something ancient and powerful and dangerous in ways that even the Celestials found alarming, and they chose to build the most inescapable structure available to them. A cluster of black holes from which nothing, not matter, not energy, not any form of conventional or force-based power, could escape. What they imprisoned inside the Maw, what they had been so concerned about that they rearranged the gravitational architecture of an entire region of space in order to contain it, is a part of this story that will return. For now, it is enough to know that the Maw was not simply an engineering marvel. It was a solution to a problem that had terrified the Celestials badly enough to justify the scale of effort required to build it. The Celestials also drew the galaxy's borders. Around the outer edges of known space, they created a barrier. It does not appear on any map as a visible line or a physical wall. It manifests instead as gravitational anomalies, as hyperspace distortions that warp and tangle navigation, routes into states so complex and dangerous that even the most advanced navigation technology developed in later millennia struggles to find reliable paths through them. This is why the regions at the western edge of the galaxy became known as the unknown regions. It was not simply that no one had gone there and mapped them. It was that going there was genuinely and profoundly dangerous, because the Celestials had deliberately made it that way. They had built a fence around their work and made the fence out of physics itself, out of gravitational forces that could tear apart ships and kill navigators and swallow signals without trace. Why they enclosed the galaxy this way is a question that has generated serious debate for as long as scholars have known the barrier was artificial rather than natural. The two most compelling theories stand in direct tension with each other. The first holds that the Celestials were protecting the interior of the galaxy from outside threats, that somewhere beyond the edge of known space there were things powerful enough and dangerous enough and hostile enough that the Celestials decided the entire interior needed to be shielded from them. The second theory runs in the opposite direction entirely. The Celestials were not keeping something out. They were keeping something in. There were forces inside the galaxy, things that had been created or that had evolved within it, that the Celestials did not want spreading beyond it into the wider universe. The barrier was a quarantine as much as a defense. It was containment, working in both directions. Both of these things may have been true at the same time. The galaxy the Celestials were managing was extraordinarily complicated, and their reasons for doing any particular thing were rarely simple or singular. With the physical structure of the galaxy established to their satisfaction, the Celestials turned their attention to its inhabitants. This is where their work becomes most intimate, most extraordinary, and, perhaps, most unsettling, depending on how you think about the ethics of it. The Celestials did not simply build a galaxy and then leave it to fill itself naturally over time. They decided what would live in it. They seeded worlds with life. They selected species and positioned them in locations that the Celestials had determined were appropriate for them. They guided development where they thought it useful. They managed the distribution of intelligent life across thousands of star systems in the same deliberate way that a gardener manages the plants in a carefully designed space. Nothing was random if the Celestials were paying attention to it. Nothing was left entirely to chance, where the Celestials had a preference about the outcome. Humans are the most significant and most debated example of this. The question of where humans originally came from, of what their actual homeworld was before they spread across the galaxy and became the most widespread intelligent species in known history, is one of the oldest and most stubbornly contested questions in galactic archaeology and anthropology. The evidence points toward an answer that is deeply strange for those who prefer to think of human civilization as something that arose naturally and spread outward from its point of origin. The evidence suggests that humans did not naturally evolve on any particular world and then spread from there. The Celestials seeded them. They placed human populations on worlds they had selected for the purpose, in the core regions of the galaxy, as part of an overall plan for how the galaxy would be inhabited. This means that human civilization, which would eventually form the backbone of the Galactic Republic and produce the Jedi Order and shape galactic history for tens of thousands of years in directions whose consequences are still being felt, exists where it exists because the Celestials chose to put it there. The entire human story in the galaxy, all of it, is downstream of a decision made by beings who did not leave their names behind. The same logic applies to other species. The Corellians, who are human but carry a distinct identity tied to the system the Celestials built. The Drall, the Solonians. Each was positioned by the Celestials in the star system the Celestials had constructed, placed on worlds the Celestials had chosen for them, part of a design whose full reasoning nobody in later history could completely reconstruct. The Celestials had reasons for all of it. Every placement, every seeded world, every species guided toward a particular path of development served some purpose in their overall plan for the galaxy. Those purposes and those reasons died with them. By the time the Celestials had reached their height, by around 100,000 years before what later history would call the Battle of Yavin, they had been in contact with or had overseen the development of most of the species that would eventually shape galactic civilization. The Gree, the Kwa, the Shahu, the Kumu, the Tong, humans in the core worlds, each at a different stage of development, each occupying a different relationship to celestial power and celestial attention, but all existing within a galaxy that had been deliberately shaped around them without their full knowledge or understanding of what that meant. To accomplish all of this work, the Celestials needed help. Moving planets and chaining black holes and seeding life across thousands of star systems and building stations, the size of small moons and drawing borders around entire galaxies is not work that any set of beings, however powerful, could accomplish without assistance. The Celestials needed labor. They needed workers with the skills and the numbers and the capacity to carry out the physical execution of their cosmic engineering projects on the scale those projects demanded. And so they found them. The most important of all the species they recruited for this purpose were the Killiks. The Killiks were insect creatures. In their natural state, they operated as a hive mind, a collective consciousness distributed across every individual in the colony simultaneously, allowing thousands of workers to share awareness and coordinate their actions instantly without the need for spoken language or individual decision-making of any kind. For beings planning to build across the scale of a galaxy, this made the Killiks as close to ideal as anything they could have found. A hive mind of industrious workers who could coordinate with perfect instantaneous precision, who could be directed to complex tasks and execute them with a unity that no species of separate individuals could match, who did not tire of repetitive work the way individual minds always eventually tire, who did not develop competing personal ambitions that might interfere with the project, who did not need to be managed in the ordinary sense because the collective consciousness managed itself automatically in response to the direction it was given. The Celestials spread Killik colonies across the galaxy in a deliberate network. They placed them along the major hyperspace routes they had shaped, positioned them near the sites of their great construction projects, and put them to work. The Killiks helped build Centerpoint Station, which they called by their own name for it in their ancient language. The name the Hive remembered across hundreds of thousands of years of collective memory. They were present for the construction and positioning of the Maw. They witnessed the dragging of the Corellian planets into their final orbits. They participated in the laying of the hyperspace barrier around the galaxy's outer edges. Everywhere the Celestials worked on their great projects, Killik colonies were present alongside them, building and carrying and coordinating with the seamless efficiency of the hive mind at work. The Killiks did not write records in the way later civilizations understood record-keeping. They did not need to. The collective memory of the hive mind recorded everything that any individual Killik had experienced, distributing that information across the entire colony and passing it forward through the generations, not as documents or files or oral tradition, but as lived biological memory embedded in the consciousness of the hive itself. Hundreds of thousands of years after the Celestials were gone, the oldest surviving Killik colony, the hive called the Thurut, still carried everything its ancestors had witnessed during the Celestial era, carried it with the clarity and immediacy of recent memory rather than the faded quality of ancient history. The Killiks remembered because they had been there, and because being there was, for a hive mind, effectively the same as still being there. This is why, long after the Republic had risen and fallen, long after the Jedi had been trained and scattered and rebuilt, long after the Sith Empire had risen and crumbled and risen again, a man named Luke Skywalker communicated with the Thurut hive and learned things about the most ancient history of the galaxy that had been lost to every other source. The knowledge was not in any archive. It was not preserved in any holocron or text or tradition. It was in the biology of an insect colony that most beings in the galaxy would have dismissed as unremarkable. The Celestials had, perhaps without fully intending it, created the galaxy's most durable archive in the form of their workers. The relationship between the Celestials and the Killiks was not a partnership between equals. The gap between what the Celestials were and what the Killiks were was too vast for equality. The Celestials directed and the Killiks executed. Whether the Killiks experienced this arrangement as exploitation or as service, or simply as the natural order of things in the only world they had ever known, is impossible to determine from the outside. The hive mind does not work the way individual consciousness works, and it does not experience things the way individuals experience them. The Killiks did not necessarily resent what was asked of them in the way that an individual laborer might resent an unjust employer. They simply did what they were directed to do. They built, they witnessed, they remembered. The relationship had its limits and its end. After the Killiks had completed their greatest projects, after the Maw had been built and Centerpoint was operational, and the galaxy had been shaped into the form the Celestials intended, the Celestials made a decision about their primary workers. They ordered the Killiks to migrate. not to relocate to a different work site or a different region of the galaxy where there was more to build, to leave, to withdraw to the unknown regions beyond the outer edge of known space, beyond the very barrier the Celestials had built. The reasons given in the ancient accounts differ by source and by the tradition preserving them. Some say the Celestials feared the Killiks knew too much and did not want that knowledge circulating freely among the species of the galaxy. Others suggest the Celestials were protecting their most loyal servants from something that was coming, removing them from an area that would soon be dangerous in ways the Killiks could not defend against. Others still suggest the Celestials had simply finished their immediate use of the Killik labor force and relocated them the way a craftsman sets down a tool they have finished with, without particular sentiment in either direction. Whatever the reason, the Killiks obeyed. The hives migrated. They left the galactic core and the inhabited regions and the sites of all their great constructions behind, and withdrew into the silence of the unknown regions, where they would remain for an extraordinarily long time. The oldest and most isolated of their hives, the Thurut, settled in the most remote location available and carried the collective memory of everything they had witnessed into the dark with them, where it would wait. Other species served the Celestials in different ways and with different results. The Gree were among the most significant. Small, gray, cephalopodic beings with a remarkable natural aptitude for complex technical reasoning. They became, under celestial guidance, some of the finest technologists in the galaxy's history, working with tools and principles that later civilizations could use but not quite fully explain. The Celestials shared knowledge with the Gree, or at least permitted the Gree to observe and learn from their work at close enough range that Gree technology advanced by degrees that would have taken millions of additional years of independent development to achieve. The Gree learned to build hypergates, devices that could move beings and objects instantly from one point to another across distances so vast that conventional travel would require months or years. These were, in a meaningful sense, simplified echoes of the technology the Celestials used in Centerpoint Station. Pale shadows of the original science, impressive by any standard available to any later civilization, but reflecting only a fraction of the principles that made the original work. The Gree could build things that functioned. They could not always explain why they functioned at the level of first principles, because those first principles belonged to the Celestials and had not been fully shared. When the Celestial era ended and the Celestials disappeared from the galaxy, the Gree made a choice that revealed something about how they understood what had happened to them. They retreated. They gathered to their own small cluster of worlds, sealed themselves off from wider galactic contact as best they could, and focused on preserving what they had, rather than expanding or engaging with the galaxy that was filling up around them. They kept their technology. They maintained their methods. They continued to use and care for what they had built. But they stopped moving outward into a galaxy that no longer had its architects. Later, explorers who eventually made contact with the Gree found beings who were clearly extraordinary by any technical measure, who possessed knowledge that seemed almost anachronistic, given the simplicity of how they now lived, who built and maintained things through principles that later engineers could observe working without fully reconstructing the reasoning behind them. The fingerprints of the Celestials were all over Gree technology, visible to anyone who knew what to look for, in what shapes to expect. The Qua lived on Dathomir. They learned from the Celestials the principles behind a different form of instant transit. Stargates, infinity gates, devices that could open a passage between two fixed points and allow instantaneous movement between them. No travel time, no distance. The Celestials had built similar devices on their greatest projects as part of their own logistics and communication network across the galaxy. The Qua learned enough to build their own versions. These gates were positioned at significant locations across the galaxy as part of a network that, if fully operational and fully understood, would have made the concept of physical distance between any 2 points in the galaxy essentially irrelevant. By the time later civilizations found them, most of the gates were non-functional. The knowledge of how to repair or activate them had gone with the Qua, whose own civilization had declined from whatever it had been at its height. The world of Dathomir would eventually be settled and resettled by cultures who knew nothing of what had come before them. The Night Sisters, who would later make Dathomir their home, built their fortress directly on the ruins of a Qua site, occupying and using space that had once been a node in a Celestial-era transportation network without any awareness of what lay beneath their foundations. Ancient technology sleeping under their feet, waiting for someone who understood it to ask the right questions. The Rakata occupy a more complicated and more troubling chapter in the story of the Celestial servant species. The Rakata were amphibious beings with an extraordinary natural aptitude for force-based technology. They were among the most force-sensitive species the Celestials had encountered in an operational sense, and they had an instinct for understanding the principles behind force-imbued constructions that was genuinely rare. Where the Kilix brought hive-coordinated physical labor, and where the Gree brought technical intelligence of a particular precise kind, the Rakata brought something closer to a species-wide sensitivity to force technology, an ability to interact with force-powered constructions in ways that other species could not easily replicate. The Celestials used this. They employed the Rakata, permitted them access to force-based systems, allowed them to observe and work with celestial technology at levels that the Gree and even the Kilix were not always permitted to reach. The Celestials, perhaps, saw the Rakata's force sensitivity as something that could be developed into genuine partnership. The Rakata had different plans. They were deeply ambitious beings. Their species-wide connection to the Force ran almost entirely through the dark side, not because of a deliberate philosophical choice, but because it seemed to be a feature of their biology and their psychology. They connected to the dark side the way water runs downhill, naturally, automatically, without requiring effort or intention. Whatever balance might theoretically have existed in their force sensitivity had long since been absent or had eroded. As they accumulated more knowledge about what the Celestials had built and how it worked, their ambitions grew beyond what the Celestials had intended for them. They began to imagine themselves as something more than servants. They began to see in the technology around them the tools of an empire. The story of what the Rakata would eventually become and do with that ambition is a chapter that comes after the Celestials are gone. For now, what matters is that during the Celestial era, they were present, they were learning, they were watching, and they were planning in ways that their masters either did not detect or did not take seriously enough. Not every species with the capacity to be affected by the Celestials chose to be part of their system. The Shahu had built something of real value entirely on their own before the Celestials arrived in their region of space. They had technology, they had cities, they had a civilization that was, by any reasonable measure, sophisticated and independently developed. And when the Celestials came, and it became immediately clear what manner of beings these were, and what it meant to be noticed by them, the Shahu made a choice that speaks loudly about what the celestial presence must have felt like from the outside. They deliberately made themselves appear primitive. They dismantled whatever aspects of their civilization were visible from outside. They buried their cities under structures that looked ancient and inert and unimportant. They changed how they presented themselves entirely, hiding their actual level of development behind a careful performance of simplicity, and they waited for the Celestials to lose interest in them and move on to something else. It worked. The Celestials moved on. The Shahu were left alone. Think about what that tells you. An entire civilization of beings who had worked across generations to build technology and culture and accumulated knowledge chose, when the Celestials arrived, to pretend they were nothing. They chose obscurity over any possibility of involvement. They had looked at the relationship the Celestials had with the Killiks and the Gree and the Kwa and the Rakata, and they had decided, collectively, that they wanted no part of whatever that was. Being recruited meant becoming something the Celestials needed, and the Shahu were not willing to become something the Celestials needed. They preferred to be overlooked entirely. The Kolomi made a similar but simpler choice. They retreated to their homeworld and reduced their presence in the galaxy to the point of invisibility, making themselves uninteresting to beings operating at the scale the Celestials operated at. This, too, worked. The Kolomi passed through the Celestial era, essentially unchanged by it. Both of these choices reveal something important about how the Celestials' power actually functioned. It was not powerful simply in the way that a large army is powerful, where submission is the rational calculation, and there is no alternative worth considering. It was overwhelming in a way that made even advanced civilizations uncertain about whether they could survive engagement with it. The Celestials were a natural force in the galaxy, in a way that transcended politics entirely. They did not need to threaten anyone. They did not issue ultimatums or demand compliance through violence. Their scale of operation made negotiation meaningless and resistance absurd. Species either found a way to be useful to them, found a way to be invisible to them, or were simply incorporated into celestial plans, whether they understood it or not. In the center of all of this, balancing the servant species and the great constructions and the management of a civilization seeded across thousands of worlds, the Celestials maintained something that would not be seen again for as long as galactic history continued to be recorded. The Force, during their era, was in balance. Not the fragile and contested balance that the Jedi would spend thousands of years struggling to maintain against the steady pressure of the Sith and the darkness. Not a balance achieved through conflict and sacrifice, and constant vigilance, and the willingness to die for it. Something more fundamental, something deeper. The Celestials operated beyond the categories of light side and dark side, as later traditions understood them. They worked at a level where those distinctions were less important than equilibrium itself. Their relationship with the Force was not about choosing one half of it over the other. It was about maintaining the whole of it. Later, Jedi scholars who studied the most ancient artifacts that could be identified as celestial in origin described sensing something in the Force signature of those objects that felt like a kind of completeness they had never encountered in anything made by later hands. As if the Celestials had touched the Force in a way that had not left division behind it. This was the galaxy at its apex. A vast, ancient, carefully managed system with the Celestials at its center. Their servant species operating the great machines, life seeded across hundreds of worlds in patterns, designed to eventually produce a populated and functioning civilization. the hyperspace lanes connecting it all, the border barrier keeping the outside out and the inside in, and the force running through everything in something approaching genuine balance. Nothing that perfect endures forever. The first fracture, when it came, did not come from the servant species or from outside threats or from any failure of celestial technology or planning. It came from within the force itself. What emerged was a family. The oldest memories of the Thurut hive, carried across hundreds of thousands of years of collective insect consciousness, describe a moment on a lush tropical world where the force did something that had no precedent. It gave rise to 3 new beings, not evolved from any existing species through any natural biological process, not created through any celestial engineering project that anyone had authorized or was aware of. 3 beings formed from the force directly, emerging from a concentrated geyser of pure force energy on a world where the connection between living things and the field that surrounded them had worn so thin through ancient intensity that the boundary had essentially dissolved. 3 beings came from that geyser. They arrived already formed, already conscious, already carrying within themselves something that no other beings in the history of the galaxy had possessed or would possess again. Each of them was not merely powerful in the Force the way a gifted Jedi might be powerful, or even the way the greatest and most feared Sith Lords would be powerful thousands of years later. Each of them was, in a fundamental and literal sense, the Force, a specific aspect of it, a living embodiment of something that had previously only existed as a quality, as an abstract property of the universal energy field that connected all living things, made personal and individual and present. They came to be known, in the accounts that survived them, by tens of thousands of years, as the Father, the Daughter, and the Son. The Father embodied balance. Not the light side or the dark side, but the relationship between them. The steady point where neither overwhelmed the other and both existed in their proper proportion to each other. He was older than his children, in some sense that the ordinary categories of age could not quite capture. More patient, carrying within himself an understanding of the Force's fundamental nature that went deeper than anything his children possessed, for all that they were more immediately and more obviously powerful than anything else that had ever walked or breathed. The Daughter embodied the light side. Ancient cultures across the galaxy had names for this property of the Force. Some called it Ashla, others gave it other names that all pointed at the same essential quality: creation, growth, healing, the nurturing of life. The web of connection between living things that made them more than isolated individual beings and wove them into something larger. All of this lived in the Daughter. When she moved through her world, plants grew more vigorously in her wake. Wounded creatures recovered faster in her presence. The light side of the Force moved through her the way blood moves through a living body, continuously and naturally and without requiring effort or attention. The Son embodied the dark side. Ancient texts used the word Bogan for what he carried. It was the force of change, of transformation, of the individual drive that pushed beings to reach beyond their current state towards something more. Neither evil nor good in itself, though later civilizations would spend millennia failing to fully understand this distinction. The dark side, in its purest form as the Son embodied it, was simply the other half of what the Daughter held. One was not complete without the other. The Force itself was not complete with only one of them. The father's role was to hold the two in relationship to each other, to be the living point of balance that kept either from consuming what it was not meant to consume, that kept the tension between them productive rather than destructive. They made their home on a world where the force ran with unusual and overwhelming intensity through every stone and root and breath of air. A lush and beautiful world by every account. A world that felt, to anyone sensitive enough to perceive it, like standing at the center of something vast. The force did not merely exist there. It pulsed there. It sang there if you were capable of hearing a song in the movement of energy through living things. And on that world, there were two places that the father understood immediately and completely, were dangerous in ways that could not be overstated. The first was the font of power, a wellspring of pure dark side energy, concentrated to levels that no conventional force-sensitive being could approach without consequences. The dark side did not merely exist near the font. It pooled there, gathered across ages, into something that was more like a physical substance than an energy field, pressurized by time and depth into something with its own weight and presence. Whatever had formed it, whether it was a natural geological feature of a world where the force ran unusually strong or something else entirely, it was more dangerous than anything the Celestials had built, in the way that a volcano is more dangerous than any weapon. Weapons have intent behind them. Natural extremes simply are. The font of power simply was. And what it was an amplifier of dark side energy to levels that threatened far more than any individual who touched it. The second was the pool of knowledge, pure light side energy, concentrated in the same way but on the opposite side of the force's nature. Immense potential for healing and insight and connection between living things, also pressurized to dangerous levels by the same processes that had formed the font. Just as dangerous as the font, though in different ways and with different consequences for whoever accessed it. The father knew what these places were from the first moment he understood where his family was living. He knew with the certainty that comes from being the embodiment of balance itself, from feeling the force's nature directly, rather than interpreting it through any intermediate tradition or discipline. He knew what would happen if either of his children used these places. And so he gave them the most important prohibition of his existence as a parent and as the guardian of everything the force was trying to maintain. Never drink from the font. Never bathe in the pool. He said this quietly and with absolute certainty. Not as a suggestion, not as a preference, as a rule that he needed them to understand was not negotiable. Not because he was exerting arbitrary parental authority, but because he understood precisely what would happen if they disobeyed it, and he was not willing to watch the galaxy pay the price for that disobedience. The daughter listened with her characteristic patience and her deep, genuine love for her father. She looked at the pool, and she felt what it contained, and she understood why it called to her. It was, after all, what she was. Concentrated light side energy, speaking directly to the being who was the living embodiment of the light side. The pull was not temptation in any simple moral sense. It was more fundamental than that. It was like asking a river not to flow downhill. The pool was the direction the daughter naturally moved in, amplified to a degree she could feel in every part of her existence. She accepted the prohibition. For a time, she accepted it. The son's relationship with the font of power was different in texture and in kind. The son did not approach his prohibition with the daughter's patient acceptance. He circled the font, the way something born to the dark side circles a source of power it has not yet decided whether to take. Approaching and retreating, testing distances, studying the boundary the father had drawn and measuring it against his own nature. He was not ignorant of the danger. He understood on some level that the father's prohibition was not arbitrary and that the font was genuinely dangerous in ways that even he might not fully survive if he approached it without the right preparation or the right understanding. But understanding a danger and being willing to respect the boundary it implied were two very different things. And the son's relationship to that distinction had always been the most complicated part of who he was. He was the embodiment of ambition, of the drive to push past existing limits and reach for something more. Stopping at a line because the father had drawn it there and said to stop was, in a very fundamental sense, contrary to everything he was. The Celestials watched this family with a growing concern that their characteristic stillness and patience did not fully conceal. They had built a galaxy. They had moved planets and chained black holes and drawn the borders of known space and seeded civilizations across thousands of worlds and maintained the Force in something approaching genuine balance for longer than most species present on one entire recorded existence. They had faced complications before and found ways to manage them. But the ones were something that no tool they possessed was well suited to address. You could not build a machine to manage beings who were the Force itself in personified form. You could not redirect their behavior with the same instruments you use to redirect a hyperspace lane or reposition a planet. The problem the ones represented was not an engineering problem. It was something else entirely. The Celestials turned their collective attention toward the question of what to do, communicating through whatever means beings of their nature used to communicate with each other across the distances and dimensions of the galaxy they had built. What they understood was this: the Father was extraordinary. His ability to hold balance between his children was real, and it was remarkable. But it was not infinitely sustainable. The son and daughter were growing more powerful over time, as beings who are the Force itself will inevitably grow. The gap between what the father could manage and what the son and daughter were capable of was narrowing in a direction that made the Celestials deeply uneasy. If the daughter accessed the pool of knowledge and allowed the concentrated light side energy there to flow through her fully, she would not simply become more powerful. She would become only herself. Pure light, pure Ashla, with no relationship to what her brother carried, and therefore no longer capable of being part of any balance. The Force was not light alone. The Force was both. A daughter who had consumed the pool would be a daughter who had broken the fundamental thing the father existed to protect. And the ripple effects of that break would not remain contained within one family or one world. They would spread through the entire energy field that connected all living things in the galaxy. Every Force-sensitive being would feel the shift. Every creature, guided by instincts shaped by the Force, would feel it. The Celestials, who managed their galaxy through their profound connection to the Force, would feel it most acutely and most devastatingly of all. If the sun accessed the font of power, the consequences would be worse. The dark side of the Force, expressed through a being who was the dark side itself in living form, amplified beyond all previous measure by a wellspring of concentrated dark energy, would not simply create an extraordinarily powerful dark side user. It would create something that had the potential to tear the fabric of reality in its immediate vicinity. The kind of damage that dark side energy could cause when channeled through a being of the sun's nature and then amplified by the font, was not damage that later repair could address. It would leave wounds in the Force itself. Wounds that might never heal. Wounds through which other things might come. The solution the Celestials arrived at was called Mortis. They had, over the enormous span of their existence and the depth of their mastery of the Force, developed the knowledge and the ability to create spaces that existed outside the normal physics of the galaxy. Pocket dimensions. Realms accessible only through specific constructed gateways. Places where the rules that governed the rest of the universe could be suspended or altered. Creating such a space required a level of Force manipulation that was beyond anything any later civilization would achieve or even fully conceptualize. But the Celestials were not limited by later civilizations' understanding of what was possible. They worked with the Force directly, shaping a pocket realm that would answer to different rules and that would be accessible only through a gateway they could control. They built this realm specifically for the family. They called it Mortis. The world the ones had been living on was translated into this pocket dimension, drawn out of normal space and placed within a realm where its influence on the wider galaxy could be contained and managed. The only way in or out was through a massive monolith that served as the gateway. The monolith existed in normal space, but what lay on the other side of it did not. Inside Mortis, time moved in ways that had no simple relationship to time outside it. The landscape shifted and changed in response to the emotional and Force states of the beings who inhabited it. The light and dark sides of the Force both ran through it with an intensity that exceeded anywhere else in the galaxy. It was beautiful and strange, and completely isolated from the rest of the universe. A sanctuary and a prison simultaneously, depending on which aspect of it you needed it to be in any given moment. The father accepted Mortis. He understood why it was necessary. He understood that his family, in their current state and with the font and pool available to them, had become a danger to the balance they were meant to embody. He understood that the Celestials were not wrong, and somewhere beneath the pain of the acceptance, he may even have felt relief. The constant work of mediating between his children, of holding the balance against the force of two personalities, each pulling in opposite directions with the full strength of what they embodied, was not sustainable indefinitely. Mortis offered structure, a bounded space where the work could continue without the catastrophic stakes that came with doing it in the open galaxy. The children went. The gateway was sealed behind them. The ones withdrew from the galaxy into their pocket realm, where the father would spend the rest of his very long existence doing the same thing he had always done, holding the balance between light and dark, mediating between his children, maintaining the equilibrium that the Force itself required. And outside of Mortis, in the galaxy the Celestials had built and managed and loved in whatever way beings of their nature loved things, something changed. Not dramatically, not in any way that ordinary beings could have perceived or measured. But the Celestials could feel it. The force that ran through the galaxy, the force they managed through their profound and incomparable connection to it, was not quite what it had been. A fine and barely perceptible tension had entered it. The embodiments of light and dark, even locked away in their pocket dimension, even separated from the galaxy by the seal of the Mortis monolith, still existed in conflict with each other. And their existence in conflict, even at a remove, created the faintest possible tremor in the balance the Celestials maintained. It was the first sign of what was coming. The age of perfect cosmic order was behind them. What lay ahead was something the Celestials had not fully prepared for, something that would test and ultimately break everything they had built. And it would not come from outside the galaxy. It would come from within, from the very force the Celestials were connected to, from a being older and stranger and more dangerous than even they had fully reckoned with. It would come from the dark between the stars, and it would change everything. She did not begin as a monster. That is the first thing to understand about her. And it is the thing that makes everything that followed so difficult to hold in the mind all at once. The destruction she would eventually cause, the war she would ignite, the civilizations she would shake, the ancient order the Celestials had spent eons constructing, all of it unraveling in the wake of what she became. None of it started with malice. None of it started with ambition or cruelty or the desire to dominate. It started with love, and with fear, and with the very human failure of not being able to bear the thought of an ending. She came to the ones the way caretakers sometimes come to isolated families. Not through any dramatic event or deliberate summoning. She arrived, she proved herself useful, and over time, she became indispensable. The father had spent what felt like an eternity managing the endless conflict between his children, pouring every resource of his extraordinary existence into the work of mediation, holding the balance by sheer will and patience, while the son and daughter carved their world into opposing territories and fought with the Force in ways that made the ground shake and the sky split. He was exhausted in some deep and fundamental sense that transcended the ordinary meaning of the word. He could continue. He would continue. But the weight of it was becoming something he felt in every part of what he was. She changed the dynamic between the siblings in ways the father had not been able to manage alone. She had no Force power to speak of. She was mortal in the most ordinary sense, aging and finite, and soft in comparison to the eternal beings she had found herself living among. But she understood something about the relationship between the son and the daughter that went beyond what Force sensitivity could access. She understood how people who love each other can nonetheless hurt each other badly, how the very intensity of what connects two beings can become the source of the deepest wounds between them, and she understood how to reach through that without flinching. She was patient in a way that felt different from the father's patience. The father was patient because he had no choice and because he understood the cosmic stakes. She was patient because she genuinely cared, because something in her responded to these extraordinary beings not as the cosmic forces they embodied, but as the family she had found. She called herself their mother, not because she had any biological claim to that title, not because she had created them or raised them from childhood, but because the role she had stepped into was the role of a mother in everything that mattered. She fed them and worried over them and celebrated them, and felt the peculiar pride that comes from watching beings you love grow into what they are meant to be. She talked the son through moments when the dark side rose in him so intensely that he could not see past it. She found ways to redirect his energy that felt to him like freedom rather than restriction. She persuaded him once to carve beautiful chambers into the stone walls of their shared home, using the Force lightning that was his most natural expression of power, transforming something that had always been a weapon into an act of creation. He did it. The chambers were beautiful. And for a brief, extraordinary time, something in the eternal conflict between the siblings found a resting place, and the family lived in something that resembled peace. The father, watching all of this, felt something he had not felt in longer than he could easily reckon: relief. Not certainty that things would remain as they were, because certainty was not something the father dealt in. He understood too well how temporary any equilibrium was and how quickly conditions could shift. But genuine, present-tense relief. The weight had lightened, but she was aging. The ones did not age. Whatever they were, whatever the force had made them, when it poured itself into living form on that lush jungle world, they existed outside the ordinary biological processes of birth and growth and decay that governed all other living things. They were in their prime and would remain in their prime for as long as they existed, which, as far as any evidence suggested, would be effectively forever. She watched herself age among beings who did not age, watched herself decline while everything around her stayed fixed and eternal. And the fear this produced in her was not the ordinary fear of death. It was something more specific and more desperate than that. She was afraid of what would happen to them when she was gone. She could feel it already beginning. As the years passed and her body weakened, the peace she had worked so hard to build between the siblings started to fray at its edges. Small arguments returned. Small arguments became large ones. The sun's dark side energy, so carefully and patiently redirected for so many years, was finding its way back toward its most destructive expressions. The daughter's righteous anger, always present and always powerful, was surfacing more readily without someone to help her breathe through it. The family was beginning to come apart again, incrementally, in ways that would eventually become catastrophic if nothing intervened. And she could see the arc of it clearly enough to know that she would not be there when the catastrophe arrived. She would be gone. The father would be left alone with his children again. Everything would go back to what it had been before she came. Or, worse, she had learned about the font of power and the pool of knowledge during her years with the family. The father had forbidden anyone from using them with an absoluteness that required no elaboration to understand. But she also knew, in the way that you know things that are demonstrated rather than stated, that the son had drunk from the font. She could feel it in him, in the particular texture of his power, and the particular character of his ambition, and the particular way the dark side moved through him with an intensity that exceeded even what his nature alone could have produced. She knew the daughter had bathed in the pool. The same logic applied in the other direction. These were beings who had used the forbidden places and survived and become something larger than what they had been before. She began to reason herself into a conclusion that someone in a clearer state of mind might have identified earlier as the point where love had crossed over into something that could not protect anyone. If the son and the daughter had each used one of the wells and emerged with power and immortality, then perhaps using both would give a mortal being what the ones had. Perhaps it would preserve her. Perhaps she could live alongside her family forever and keep them together and keep the peace she had built and prevent the disaster she could feel coming with the certainty of someone watching a wave move toward shore. The logic was there. The intention was genuine. The desperation underneath both was the thing that made it dangerous. The thing she could not see clearly because she was inside it. She waited for her moment. The son and the daughter had been arguing for days about something that had started small and grown into the kind of confrontation that made the air crackle and the trees bend away from the center of it. The father threw himself into the work of mediation. All of his attention focused on the space between his children, doing what he had always done with everything he had. She slipped away. She found the font of power first. It pulsed with dark side energy that felt, at close range, like standing next to the largest and most violent thing she had ever been near. The dark side did not merely exist at the font. It pressed outward from it, concentrated and pressurized, and alive in a way that had nothing to do with the living beings who channeled it elsewhere. She did not hesitate. She had made the decision before she arrived. She drank. Dark side energy flooded through her body all at once, every nerve and cell and bone receiving it simultaneously. And the sensation was nothing she had any reference point for. Everything she already was became more intense, at a factor she had no framework to measure. Her love, which had always been the most powerful thing in her, became something much larger and much more dangerous than love is designed to be when it exists at ordinary scale. Her fear became enormous. Her need to protect, to hold, to keep safe and close and forever expanded to fill her entirely and beyond, pressing against the edges of what her body could contain. She was not done. She ran to the pool of knowledge and threw herself into its waters. Light side energy poured into a body that was already full to its limits with dark side power. The wisdom of the light side, which existed in the pool in the same pressurized and concentrated form as the dark side existed in the font, moved through her in waves of insight and understanding, so vast and so immediate that they felt less like learning and more like being rewritten. She felt as if she understood everything: the nature of the Force, the shape of the galaxy, the purpose of the Ones, and the meaning of what the Celestials had built, and the entire arc of existence from its beginning to wherever its ending would eventually be. Two opposite extremes of the same force, both at maximum concentration, met inside a mortal body that had not been built to contain either of them separately, let alone both simultaneously. The father sensed it before he could see it. Something tore in the Force, a clean and absolute rupture in the fabric of everything he had spent his existence protecting. He broke away from his children and ran. He reached the pool and used his power to pull her out of the water. What he pulled out was not what he had put into his arms so many times before. The transformation had already run its course. The woman he had loved as the mother of his family, the person who had brought peace to a war that had been tearing his existence apart, was gone, not hidden, not changed in some gradual and recoverable way. Gone in the full and irreversible sense of the word. Something else had taken her place. She became Abeloth. Her appearance shifted and twisted in ways that no stable physical form should be capable of, sometimes almost recognizable. Almost the face and body of the woman who had come to them and learned their names and made them a family. And then, in the next moment, something monstrous, too many limbs, a face that moved like water, features that rearranged themselves in patterns that had no correspondence to anything in nature. She was immortal now, as she had intended to be. She had achieved exactly the transformation she had sought. She would not age. She would not die in the ordinary way. She would continue. But everything in her that had made her worth preserving had been consumed in the process. Her love, which had been the truest and most powerful thing about her, became obsession in its most suffocating form. The desire to protect became the need to possess, to control, to keep every being she cared about close to her, regardless of what they needed or wanted, because the caring and the possessing had become the same thing, and she could no longer feel the difference. Her wisdom, all that concentrated light side insight that had poured through her in the pool, twisted into cunning of a particular kind. The cunning that serves no purpose except to find the most effective path to what it wants and to take it. She called herself the beloved Queen of the Stars. In her mind, she was still the mother. She was still protecting her family. She would keep them safe forever now. She would keep them close. She would make certain they could never leave or hurt each other or hurt her. And she would do it with the full force of what she had become, which was more powerful than anything that had walked or breathed in the galaxy since the Celestials themselves were at their height. She turned on the son and the daughter immediately. These were beings who embodied the living force in its two most fundamental expressions. They had fought each other to a standstill 100 times. They had shaken the ground and split the sky and bent reality around their conflicts. Nothing in the galaxy should have been able to make them submit. Abeloth did it in the space of a moment that nobody who witnessed it ever fully recovered from. Force energy in quantities and qualities that made the son and daughter's own considerable power look small, hit them before they could respond to it, before they could even fully register what had changed. They were forced to their knees. Both of them, simultaneously, bowed before her, choosing that over the alternative she made clearly available to them. The son, characteristically, looked at what Abeloth had become and saw an angle. If she was more powerful than the daughter, then perhaps she was an ally worth having, a force that could finally tip the eternal balance toward the dark side in the way he had always wanted. He attempted alliance. She denied it without pause. She did not want an ally. She wanted absolute submission. She wanted everything on her own terms. And she wanted it forever. When the son understood this, when he realized that Abeloth's version of keeping the family together meant keeping him in a cage of her making just as readily as it meant keeping the daughter there, his calculated interest collapsed instantly into self-preservation, and then into something much more straightforward than that. He was afraid of her. The father stood between Abeloth and his children with everything he had, which was extraordinary and insufficient. He could feel in the force the full scope of what she had become, the way two opposite extremes of the same energy, both amplified to their maximum, and neither fully integrated or balanced within the being that contained them, had created something that operated outside any framework he had ever encountered. The Celestials had built a galaxy and maintained it in balance. They had faced complications and managed them through the depth of their knowledge and their connection to the Force. Abeloth was not a complication. She was a catastrophe at the scale of the Force itself, a rupture in the fundamental nature of things. The moment she transformed, the Force changed across the galaxy, not subtly, not in the fine and barely perceptible way that the sealing of the Ones into Mortis had changed it. This was something that Force-sensitive beings anywhere could feel if they were present in their bodies in the way that Force sensitivity requires. A scream moved through the energy field that connected all living things, a cold wave of wrongness with no identifiable source. A sense that something fundamental had broken. Animals on worlds that had never been visited by any intelligent species felt it. They panicked. They fled. They responded to something in their nervous systems that had no rational explanation in their immediate environment, because the thing that had caused it was not in their immediate environment. It was in the Force itself, and the Force moved through them the way it moved through everything. Plants altered their growth patterns. Gravity fluctuated in small but measurable ways on worlds spread across enormous distances from where the transformation had occurred. Sensitive beings reported nightmares they could not explain. Stars seemed, for a brief and terrible moment, to dim. Chaos had entered the galaxy with a specificity and an intensity that the careful celestial order had never had to accommodate before. The father made his first tactical decision quickly. He separated Abeloth from his children, removing the son and the daughter to a location she could not immediately reach, buying time for the larger response that was going to be necessary. He sent out a call through the Force to every Celestial who remained. He communicated in whatever way beings of their nature communicated across the galaxy they had built, with the clarity and the urgency that the situation required. There was no diplomatic framing. There was no careful language designed to manage the reaction. This was simply the truth of the emergency. Something has been born that threatens everything we have made, and we need everyone we have to stop it, the Celestials answered. So did the servants they had positioned across the galaxy, through the long centuries of their management of it. The Killiks came, their hive mind allowing them to coordinate and mobilize with the seamless efficiency that had made them the most valuable laborers in all of celestial construction history. The Gree came with their technical knowledge. The Qua came with what force sensitivity they possessed. Everyone who could help mobilized, because the alternative to helping was watching the Force itself continue to tear apart in ways that no one and nothing would survive if the process ran to its conclusion. The father gave his children a role they had never been asked to perform before. He asked them to work together, not to stop fighting, which was too much to ask, and perhaps even cosmically wrong to ask, given what they embodied, but to direct their opposing natures toward the same problem, to fight on the same side against something that neither of them could face alone. He merged their consciousness with the Thurut hive, the daughter's light side power and the son's dark side energy flowing simultaneously through the hive mind of thousands of Killik workers, giving those workers access to abilities they had never possessed on their own, and giving the ones a reach and a physical presence in the world that their individual forms could not achieve. Every Killik became an extension of a force, God's will. The construction project they were about to undertake was the largest and most technically audacious thing the Celestials had ever attempted, and it needed to happen while simultaneously waging a war against a being who could force gods to their knees. They were going to build the Maw. The plan was more than bold. It was the kind of plan that only beings who had already moved planets and built pocket dimensions and enclosed entire galaxies within hyperspace barriers would even conceive of attempting. They would build a prison made of black holes. Not one black hole, which already represented the most extreme gravitational environment the universe could produce. Multiple black holes, chained together in deliberate formation through precise and coordinated manipulation of gravitational forces on a scale that would alter hyperspace routes across the galaxy just as a side effect of the construction. They would position these singularities near Kessel, and they would configure them so that anything at the center of the cluster would be pulled in multiple competing directions by multiple gravity wells simultaneously, making any form of escape not merely difficult but physically impossible. Centerpoint Station became the primary instrument of construction. The Celestials had built it to move planets, and they had moved planets with it, dragging worlds through hyperspace from wherever they existed, and positioning them in the Corellian system with exact precision. Now, they turned that same instrument toward different materials. Black holes exist throughout the galaxy in enormous numbers, the collapsed remnants of massive stars that have exhausted their fuel, and collapsed under their own gravity to points of infinite density. The Celestials began reaching for them. Centerpoint Station extended its gravitational manipulation across enormous distances and grabbed singularity after singularity, pulling them through hyperspace in ways that nothing had ever been pulled through hyperspace before. Black holes, the most extreme objects the universe contains, being moved across the galaxy like pieces on a board, positioned near Kessel one by one, arranged with the same deliberate precision the Celestials brought to everything they built. The gravitational forces involved in this process were not clean or contained. Creating the Maw caused disruptions that propagated through hyperspace routes across entire regions of the galaxy. Ancient accounts describe something they called a shattering, a period when navigation throughout large portions of the galaxy became unpredictable, when routes that had been reliable for thousands of years abruptly changed character, and explorers found themselves arriving at unexpected locations or failing to exit hyperspace where they had intended. This was collateral damage on a cosmic scale, unavoidable given the nature of the project. Accepted because the alternative to building the prison was leaving Abeloth free, and the damage Abeloth could do was incalculably greater than the damage a disrupted hyperspace lane could cause. Sinkhole Station was built alongside the Maw to serve as an anchor and a stabilizer, a fixed point that would interact with Centerpoint to maintain the configuration of the black holes and prevent the cluster from drifting out of the precise arrangement required to keep the prison functional. It was a caretaker station, automated in its essential functions, designed to continue doing its job regardless of whether anyone came to check on it or understand what it was doing. While all of this construction was proceeding, Abeloth was not waiting. She left the world where she had transformed and began spreading her influence through the Force across the stars. This was not a simple physical movement of a single body from place to place. Abeloth operated through the Force in a way that reflected the particular catastrophic combination of power she had absorbed. She could extend herself. She could reach through the Force and touch minds and drive them in directions she chose. Worlds where she focused her attention experienced what later records described as Force plagues, collective madness spreading through populations who had no physical contact with her and no rational explanation for what was happening to them. Animals went feral, crops failed in patterns that could not be explained by weather or disease. Beings who were sensitive to the Force found it suddenly hostile or incomprehensible in ways it had never been before, as if the Force itself had changed its character in their vicinity. She reached for the Sun, not to work with him, to use him. She could feel the dark side in him, and she could feel how that dark side responded to the amplified dark energy she carried. And she exploited that resonance with everything her twisted cunning had given her. The Sun hesitated. This is the most uncomfortable part of an already uncomfortable story. The being who embodied the dark side, who was the Sun and carried all that meant, was capable of being tempted by what Abeloth represented. Her raw power, the purity of dark side energy, at a concentration that exceeded anything he had access to through his own nature. The possibility that she represented the final tipping of the balance in his direction. He hesitated, and in the space of his hesitation, he made decisions that may have cost the Celestials dearly. During the early stages of the conflict, some fragments of ancient record, preserved in the Thurut memory and later recovered by scholars who spent their careers trying to make sense of what the Killiks remembered, suggest the Sun shared information he should not have shared. plans for how the Celestials intended to capture Abeloth, details of the construction timetable for the Maw, specifics about the timing and the approach that would allow Abeloth to be in the wrong place relative to the trap when the critical moment came. She used what he gave her. The early attempts to corral her into the Maw's gravitational influence failed, and the ancient records do not say explicitly why. But the implications are there for anyone reading carefully enough to follow them. He eventually came to understand his mistake in the most direct way possible. Abeloth demonstrated, with a clarity that left no room for rationalization, that she had no more use for a partner than she had ever had. Her idea of what the Sun's role in her new order would be was submission. The same thing she demanded from the daughter, the same thing she had forced on both of them in that first terrible moment after her transformation. The Sun valued his own power and his own freedom more than he valued almost anything else. He switched sides, fully and without ambiguity, not out of any philosophical conversion, but out of pure self-preservation and rage at what she had tried to make him into. From that point, he fought against her as hard as his nature allowed him to fight anything. The battle that followed was not a conventional war, in any sense that the phrase normally implies. It did not have clear front lines or armies that could be counted, or engagements that could be described cleanly in terms of who attacked what and what the result was. It was a war of force gods, which meant it was a conflict conducted through dimensions of existence that ordinary beings do not have access to and cannot fully perceive or describe. The Celestials fought Abeloth with their full connection to the Force, which was the deepest and most sophisticated connection any being had ever had to the energy that ran through all living things in the galaxy. The ones fought her with their nature, with what they were, in the most literal and irreducible sense. Killik hives channeled the daughter's light side power in waves that could push back against Abeloth's influence wherever it had taken hold in a mind or a world. Cleansing the force sickness, she spread the way strong sunlight cleanses a dark room. The daughter, for all that she was diminished from what she had been before the sun, drank from the font, and she bathed in the pool, was still a force god, and what she poured through the Killik hive mind was still something no mortal force user would ever experience or fully understand. The Celestials built additional installations to support the main prison, Maelstrom engines, machines of a scale and a function that later scholarship could only partially reconstruct, positioned at key points in the galaxy to manipulate gravitational forces in coordination with Centerpoint Station. The whole project was an act of engineering simultaneously with an act of war, building the cage while fighting to keep the prisoner from noticing or disrupting the construction. The final confrontation came when the trap was ready. How they did it, how they maneuvered Abeloth to the center of the Maw cluster at the moment of final activation, the ancient records are unclear on. Some fragments suggest deception, that the Celestials offered her something she wanted badly enough to move toward it without fully calculating the trap. Others suggest brute force, that when the Maw was as complete as they could make it, the daughter and son and what remained of the Celestials drove her toward Kessel through coordinated force pressure from multiple directions, herding her like something that needs to be contained rather than destroyed. Others suggest it was the Sun who mattered most in the final moments, that his dark side nature gave him a specific leverage over Abeloth that the daughter did not have, and that he used it with a precision and a willingness to harm something he had once wanted to be close to. That speaks to the particular kind of resolve that only comes when you have been betrayed badly by something you trusted. Centerpoint Station activated with its full power at the moment Abeloth was at the cluster's center. The gravitational configuration of the maw locked into its final form. The black holes chained and positioned with such care over such extended and costly effort settled into the arrangement that the Celestials had designed them to hold, and the competing gravity wells closed around Abeloth from every direction simultaneously. The force of each singularity pulling against every other, creating a cage of competing impossibilities that no being, however powerful, could navigate out of. The maw sealed itself around the mother. But sealing her required more than mechanics. The daughter made a sacrifice. She poured a massive portion of her light side essence, not power borrowed for the occasion, but actual pieces of what she fundamentally was, into the binding that held Abeloth in place, creating a force seal within the maw that would hold the mother not simply through the physical impossibility of escaping a black hole cluster, but through the direct opposition of light side energy against the chaotic combination of forces that Abeloth embodied. The daughter survived this. She was not destroyed, but she was diminished in a way that was real and permanent, and that she felt in every part of what she was from that moment forward. Ancient texts phrase it differently than clinical description does. They say the daughter's light dimmed to keep the darkness contained. They are speaking literally. It was enough. Abeloth was imprisoned. The cost was staggering in ways that went far beyond the daughter's sacrifice and the disrupted hyperspace routes and the individual losses of the war. The Celestials were broken. The war had not destroyed them all, but it had done something that thousands of years of managing a galaxy in all its complexity had not managed to do. It had shattered them. The force energy required to build the maw, to move black holes across the galaxy, using Centerpoint Station at maximum capacity for an extended period, to fight a war simultaneously against a being who could force gods to their knees. All of it had demanded more from the Celestials than they had to give and remain what they had been. The accounts that survive suggest that many of them died in the process. Not violently, but through a kind of depletion, the way a fire dies when there is nothing left for it to consume. Others survived, but in a state so reduced from their original condition that survival may have been an inadequate description of what they were doing. The beings who had built a galaxy and maintained it in balance and managed its civilizations and kept the force running through it in something approaching genuine order for longer than any mortal species had existed were, after the war with Abeloth, simply not enough of what they had been to continue being what they had been. By around 30,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, the last trace of the Celestials had vanished from known space. Nobody saw them go. There was no final gathering, no ceremony, no farewell recorded in any surviving account. They simply stopped being present. The beings who had shaped everything, who had seeded life across thousands of worlds and moved planets with a machine they had built and enclosed the galaxy within a barrier and imprisoned the most dangerous force entity in existence within a cluster of black holes they had, assembled from singularities dragged across the stars, were gone. The galaxy they had built continued to exist. The things they had built continued to function, but the builders themselves were absent with a totality that left no comfortable explanation. A scholar named Inmot Bowen, working in an era already far removed from the celestial age, proposed what is perhaps the darkest of the theories, about what happened to them. He suggested that the barrier the Celestials had built around the galaxy, designed to keep threats out and certain things in, had become their cage. That, weakened by the war with Abeloth, depleted in ways they could not recover from in any timeline that mattered. The Celestials had found themselves unable to pass through the barrier they themselves had created. That they were trapped inside a galaxy that was increasingly no longer the one they had managed and shaped. Isolated by their own architecture, too diminished to operate the things they had built, they faded. Something eliminated the remainder of them. Something saw the weakness and took the opportunity. The Rakata. This is where the story of the Celestials intersects with the story of the species they had employed. Trusted to work with Force technology, at levels most of their servants were not permitted to access, and perhaps underestimated in the particular way that very powerful beings sometimes underestimate those who serve them. The Rakata had been watching. They had been learning. During the long years of their service, they had been accumulating knowledge about how celestial technology worked at a level of practical familiarity that no other servant species had achieved, because their natural force sensitivity gave them an intuitive relationship with force-powered constructions that the Gree and the Kilix, for all their other capabilities, could not quite match. They understood it from the inside, the way someone understands an instrument they have played for many years. They could feel how it worked. They could use it. They could extrapolate from what they knew toward things they had not been shown. When the Celestials were weakened and their numbers reduced and their presence in the galaxy diminished from what it had been, the Rakata made their decision. They turned on their masters and hunted down whatever remained of them. Not out of any philosophical opposition to what the Celestials had stood for. Not out of any desire for a different kind of galaxy. Out of the simplest and most ancient motivation available to a species that had always been drawn to the dark side and had always wanted what others possessed. They wanted what the Celestials had. They wanted the technology. They wanted the power. They wanted the galaxy. By 35,000 years before, what later history would call the Battle of Yavin, the Rakata had already begun the construction of what they would call the Infinite Empire, built on the ruins of the Celestial Order and powered by technologies they had learned to copy in their own degraded and violent way from the masters they had betrayed and eliminated. The Celestials were gone or dying. The Rakata stepped into the power vacuum with everything they had been preparing during the years of service, and they filled it with the darkest empire the galaxy had known since Abeloth had threatened to end everything. Before the Celestials vanished entirely, they dealt with their most loyal servants. The Kilix received their final instruction in the form of a command delivered simultaneously to every colony across the galaxy. Migrate. Move to the unknown regions beyond the barrier. The command was absolute. Why they gave it carries two explanations that stand in tension with each other. The most generous reading suggests the Celestials were protecting their most loyal servants, removing them from a galaxy that was about to become very dangerous for beings closely associated with celestial power. The darker reading suggests the Celestials feared what the Kilix carried. The hive mind had witnessed everything. It was the most complete living record of everything the Celestials had ever done. That knowledge, circulating freely among beings who would no longer have celestial guidance, may have seemed like a risk they were not willing to accept as they faded. The Kilix obeyed. They moved. The great hives withdrew into the unknown regions and went quiet. By the time the Galactic Republic rose, the Kilix were myths. Strange mound formations on Alderaan were the only physical evidence that they had ever existed in the known galaxy. The beings who had helped build the most extraordinary constructions in galactic history had become legends. And then not even legends, just archaeological curiosities that scholars puzzled over without context. Some hives survived in hibernation in the deep, unknown regions, waiting. The oldest and most isolated, the Thurut, carried the full memory of everything uninterrupted through hundreds of thousands of years of exile. The closest thing to a complete historical record of the celestial era that existed anywhere in the galaxy, preserved in the biology of an insect colony that most beings would have dismissed without a second thought. The galaxy entered what later historians would call the Dark Age. This name is accurate not because the period was unusually violent, though it was. It is accurate because the light that had been present during the celestial era was gone. The light of beings who understood the Force deeply enough to manage it. The light of oversight that kept the galaxy's most powerful technologies from being turned to the worst possible purposes. That light was gone. What filled the darkness was whatever the mortal species of the galaxy chose to fill it with. The first thing they chose was the Rakata's empire. The Rakata were not good inheritors of anything the Celestials had built, but they were effective ones, in the way that a fire is effective at consuming what it is fed. They took the principles of celestial technology and copied them with varying degrees of success, and no degree of the wisdom that had originally governed those principles. Their greatest creation reflected this perfectly. The Starforge was the Rakata's answer to Centerpoint Station. Designed for production rather than construction, powered not by the balanced and sophisticated celestial force connection, but by fear and pain and hatred. The dark side of the Force, not understood as a half of something that required balance to remain stable, but extracted as a raw fuel through the suffering of Force-sensitive beings fed into the system. The Starforge orbited a star near Lehon, and it could produce war machines in quantities that defied ordinary logistics. Starships assembled faster than any conventional shipyard could manage, powered by the concentrated darkness of enslaved minds. The Celestials had built tools to nurture life and shape space. The Rakata built a tool to amplify cruelty. The difference between these two things is the entire distance between wisdom and its absence. The Starforge corrupted the Rakata as they used it. The feedback worked in both directions. The more darkness they fed into it, the more it demanded, and the more they became the thing they were feeding it. The cycle had no terminus except catastrophe, and it ran until catastrophe arrived. The Infinite Empire at its height controlled approximately 500 worlds. Their hyperdrives could only reach Force-rich worlds, which bounded their expansion in ways they found endlessly frustrating. The celestial barrier at the galaxy's edge blocked them further. They were caged by architecture they had inherited from the masters they had betrayed, and could not fully understand well enough to dismantle. 500 worlds was still the largest empire the galaxy had seen in the era following the Celestials. Their mark on galactic history was deep and, in several respects, permanent. They distributed holocron technology across the worlds they touched, creating rough equivalents of the Force-imbued knowledge storage devices the Celestials had pioneered. Every Jedi holocron and every Sith holocron traces its conceptual lineage back through the Rakata to celestial technology the Rakata themselves had only partially understood. The words that later cultures used for the Force's fundamental qualities, Ashla for the light side, Bogan for the dark, likely came through the Rakata as well. The trail of those words, followed backward through the scholarship, leads past the earliest Jedi traditions toward the Rakata, and beyond them toward the silence where the Celestials' actual history should be. The Infinite Empire collapsed from within. A plague moved through the Rakata population, targeting force sensitivity directly, stripping it away, leaving them biologically intact but cut off from the force in a way that was total and irreversible. The most compelling theory blamed the Starforge itself. The feedback loop of feeding dark side corruption into a system that amplified that corruption, eventually turning inward on the source. Whatever caused it, the result was absolute. The Starforge could no longer be operated. The hyperdrive stopped working. The subject worlds recognized the moment and took it. The Empire collapsed in a span of years that was almost instantaneous by any celestial measure. The Starforge remained, hidden in the Leon system, vast and dark and patient. Thousands of years later, a Jedi who had been many things in his extraordinary life would find it, face in himself the same corruption the Rakata had fed into it, and the story of the Starforge would come to an end that connected directly back to its celestial origins. The survivors of the Rakata gathered on Lehon and called themselves the Elders. They kept records of what had happened to them and waited for someone to come and ask. Revan came, and the Elders told him everything. But that is not the story we are telling here. The things the Celestials had built did not require anyone to understand them in order to keep working. Centerpoint Station continued to operate at the heart of the Corellian system. Beings settled Corellia and found the station above them and stared at it and disagreed about what it was. Some worshipped it. Some attempted to study it. Eventually, they would reverse engineer enough of it to operate certain functions, and those functions would make Corellia one of the most significant systems in the galaxy for reasons that had nothing to do with natural resources and everything to do with what the Celestials had deliberately placed there. But they never fully understood what they had. They knew how to use pieces of it. They never knew what it had been built to do or what it was still doing. Beneath the surface of Kessel, a celestial tracking device hummed along in the dark, monitoring gravitational anomalies across the galaxy just as it had been built to do, tended only by creatures that had no idea what it was. Smugglers eventually found it, thousands of years after it had been built, still running, still measuring forces that no one alive understood the significance of. Near the Maw, Sinkhole Station floated in its appointed position, maintaining the gravitational configuration of the black hole cluster, anchoring the force seal the daughter had poured her light into. Nobody came to service it. Nobody checked on it. It simply continued, automatic and silent and patient, the most important machine in the galaxy that nobody knew existed, keeping the most dangerous prisoner in the galaxy contained. The Maw itself kept the space around Kessel strange and difficult and dangerous in ways that affected navigation for as long as the Republic existed, providing an effect that later explorers measured and named and studied from careful distances without ever approaching a complete understanding of what had created it or why. Smugglers knew to respect the Maw. The Empire, building the Maw installation there during the period of Palpatine's rule, chose the location for its isolation and its natural barriers, conducting weapons testing in the extreme gravitational environment without any awareness of what the environment was doing beyond the physics of gravity. Nobody told Palpatine that he was conducting superweapon tests in the prison yard of the oldest captive in the galaxy. Nobody knew to tell him. Abeloth waited. She was the most patient prisoner imaginable. For the same reasons, she was the most dangerous one. She was ancient. She was cunning. She had access to the Force through the nature of what she had become, and the Force was present everywhere, including within the Maw, and she could feel through it whenever conditions changed. She reached outward when the Maw's configuration allowed her to do so, which was rarely and briefly in the early millennia of her imprisonment, when the Ones were still maintaining the prison. She sent whispers. She influenced what she could reach. She found the Killik hives most susceptible to her particular kind of dark side resonance, and she worked on them across generations, seducing them with illusions of love and belonging and the promise of a queen who would never leave them and always protect them. Some queens cut their nests off from the broader collective song of the hive mind and served Abeloth in secret, maintaining hidden structures and preserving her story and waiting for her return. The Thurut hive, oldest and most isolated, was aware of all of this and maintained its own integrity through the particular resolve that comes from knowing the full truth. They had been there. They remembered. They understood what Abeloth was and what she wanted, and why nothing she offered could be accepted without becoming exactly what she wanted you to become. They stayed clean. They carried the memory forward. They waited. Within Mortis, the eternal conflict continued. The father had not stopped working. He had never stopped working, sealed inside the pocket dimension with his children, managing the balance between light and dark, as he had always managed it. He kept the foundational equilibrium of the Force as stable as it could be maintained, given the conditions he was operating within. The daughter and the son fought their endless conflict in the beautiful and strange landscape of a world that existed outside normal time, and the father stood between them as he had always stood, patient and exhausted and absolutely committed to the work. But they could not entirely disengage from what was happening in the galaxy outside. The Force connected everything, and the Ones were part of everything, sealed away or not. When Abeloth escaped her prison, which she managed periodically when major disruptions in the Force created cracks she could slip through, the Ones could feel it. The father permitted his children to intervene. There are fragments in the ancient records that describe something like an activation protocol, dormant celestial technology detecting a breach in the Maw's containment and triggering a response. The daughter and son could project themselves through the Mortis monolith gateway in ways that fell short of full physical emergence, but allowed them to act in the galaxy in limited ways. They would rally what remained of the Killik hives that were still loyal. They would activate the automated systems the Celestials had built. They would use Centerpoint Station to tighten the Maw's black holes back into their proper configuration. They would reseal whatever crack Abeloth had exploited. This happened more than once. The marks of Abeloth's periodic escapes are visible in galactic history for those who know what they are looking at. Extinctions that have no clear natural cause, Force plagues that sweep through populations of sensitive beings and leave devastation that cannot be explained by ordinary dark side influence. Civilizations that collapse rapidly and without obvious reason. Stars that dim across a region of the galaxy and then brighten again over a period of years, as if something had briefly altered the nature of the Force that connected them to everything else. The pattern is there. The cause is not visible in any conventional historical record because none of the civilizations that experienced the effects knew what was causing them. The most significant shift in this long cycle came from a direction nobody could have predicted. Anakin Skywalker found Mortis. He was not the first to know it existed. Legends of a place accessible through a massive, ancient monolith. A world outside normal space where time moved strangely, and the Force ran with overwhelming intensity, had circulated in Jedi tradition for long enough that they had become part of the background of Jedi mysticism, without ever crystallizing into anything specific or actionable. Qui-Gon Jinn had known something about it. Certain holocrons contained fragments of accounts that described an approach. But the galaxy is vast, and Mortis existed outside normal space, and the monolith that served as its gate did not announce itself, and so the legends remained legends until a specific combination of circumstances brought Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi and Ahsoka Tano to the point in space where the gateway waited. The father had been expecting someone like Anakin for a very long time. The father was dying. This is the phrase the ancient records use, and it is, in its own way, the most extraordinary single fact in the entire history of the Ones. The embodiment of balance, the being who had held the Force in equilibrium between his children for hundreds of thousands of years, was approaching his end. The kind of end that only becomes available to a being of his nature when the purpose he had been created or called into existence to fulfill is reaching a transition point. He was dying because the work was changing. Because the galaxy's relationship with the Force was moving towards something that required a different kind of keeper than the father had been. He needed someone to take his place. Someone who could hold the balance. Someone who had the potential to stand between light and dark and maintain the point of equilibrium that the galaxy required. He believed Anakin was that person. The prophecy that the Jedi Order had been built around, the one that spoke of a chosen one who would bring balance to the Force, was not, in the Father's understanding, simply about the Jedi and the Sith and the specific conflict of their era. It was about the ancient work. It was about the balance that the Celestials had maintained through their own connection to the Force, and that the Father had maintained within Mortis, and that the galaxy needed to have maintained in some form by someone with the capacity to do it. Anakin refused. He refused the Father's offer to become his successor, to take on the role of the cosmic balance keeper that the Father had held for hundreds of thousands of years. He refused it for reasons that were human and understandable, and entirely inadequate to the scale of what was being asked. He had people he loved. He had a life. He had a war he was fighting and a republic he was trying to save and a woman he would not leave. He said no. The consequences of that refusal were not what anyone planned. The father died. The son, freed from the father's restraining influence, killed the daughter. The daughter, in the final act of her existence, passed her light side essence into Ahsoka Tano before her power faded entirely. The sun was destroyed. The Ones ended. The balance of the Force, the cosmic equilibrium that the Father had maintained within Mortis and that had radiated from Mortis outward into the galaxy through the Force itself, was suddenly without its keeper, not gone. The Force does not simply stop existing because the beings who maintained its balance are absent, but untended in a way it had not been since the Celestials disappeared. The mantle of the cosmic balance keeper had not been accepted by anyone. It floated, unclaimed, in the Force. Something transferred. The Thurut Hive, which had witnessed everything and remembered everything, understood what had happened in ways that no Jedi or scholar of that era could access. Anakin Skywalker had refused the Father's explicit offer. But by being present at the moment of the transition and by being the one the Father had identified as the candidate, something had nevertheless passed to him, not the full weight of what the Father had carried. Anakin was not capable of that, in the way the Father had been capable of it, but a connection, a responsibility, a thread of the cosmic work that connected Anakin's lineage to the balance in ways that would not become fully apparent until the next generation. The most important guardian of Abeloth's prison was Centerpoint Station, and Centerpoint Station was still operational through the entire period of the Galactic Civil War, through the rise of the Empire and its fall, through the return of the Republic, through the Yuuzhan Vong War and every conflict that followed. As long as Centerpoint's systems ran, the Maw held. As long as the Maw held, Abeloth remained where she had been placed 100,000 years before. The galaxy went about its affairs, fought its wars, built its institutions, destroyed them, built them again, without any awareness of what was being maintained on its behalf by a station most beings regarded as an archaeological curiosity or a strategic asset whose properties they had barely begun to understand. Jacen Solo, later known as Darth Caedus, destroyed Centerpoint Station. He did not know what he was doing. He was a Sith Lord in the middle of a civil war, and he saw a weapon being deployed against him. And he eliminated it with the Force sensitivity and the tactical skill of someone who had once been one of the most gifted Jedi of his generation. He had no idea that eliminating the weapon was eliminating the primary maintenance mechanism of a prison that had been keeping the oldest captive in the galaxy contained for 100,000 years. He could not have known. Nobody who could have told him was still alive or accessible. Nobody had been maintaining the knowledge of what Centerpoint Station was really doing for long enough that it still existed in any form anyone would have thought to consult. Abeloth felt the shift the moment it happened. The gravitational configuration of the Maw changed in ways she could feel through the Force, subtle but absolute. The difference between a locked door and a door with a weakened hinge. She began to reach. She began to extend her consciousness through the cracks that had opened in her containment, reaching for minds, reaching for the Force itself, finding Jedi Knights in Luke Skywalker's academy and touching their minds with hers. And they went insane, because what touched them was something that no training had prepared them to resist. She emerged fully not long after. She took physical form through possession, inhabiting beings whose Force sensitivity gave her a foothold in the physical world, moving through multiple avatars simultaneously, spreading across the galaxy in the way she had always spread when she was free, through the Force and through minds and through the particular kind of chaos that follows when something very old and very powerful and very willing to inflict suffering gets loose. She found the lost tribe of the Sith, a group that had been isolated on a remote world for thousands of years, and whose dark side traditions made them exactly the kind of instrument she needed. She drove Jedi insane on Coruscant and elsewhere, using the Force connection that linked all sensitive beings as a channel for the madness she had always carried within herself. Luke Skywalker fought her. He fought her at Sinkhole Station, which he had found and entered and navigated through the labyrinth it had become. The deranged Killik hives that Abeloth had corrupted over the centuries, maintaining it in the state she had shaped them to maintain it. He fought her avatars across multiple locations. He found the Thurut hive, and the Thurut hive told him everything. Everything they had witnessed, everything they had carried in their collective memory through hundreds of thousands of years of exile and waiting. The full history of the Celestials and the Ones and Abeloth's transformation and her imprisonment and the cycles of her escapes and recaptures. Luke Skywalker learned what the galaxy actually was, what had actually been done to it and for it and within it, long before any of the traditions that had shaped his understanding existed. He could not defeat Abeloth alone. He could not. And this is the detail that matters most, because it tells you something about what the Celestials understood when they built the system that had contained her for so long. Light alone was not sufficient. The daughter alone had not been enough to build the prison. The son had been needed. Both sides of the force, in something approaching unity, working against the same enemy. This truth, which the father had embodied simply by existing as the balance between his children, manifested at the end of Abeloth's final emergence in the most unexpected form available. Luke Skywalker and Darth Krayt, a Jedi and a Sith Lord, working together. Krayt had survived through dark side, means that kept him technically alive past the point where ordinary biology would have ended him, ancient in his own right by the standards of human lifespans, carrying a dark side tradition that in its own strange and terrible way traced back through generations of dark side understanding toward the same ancient roots that everything else traced back to. He and Luke pursued Abeloth together, fought her together, struck her down together. The combined force, light and dark, in something that was not harmony but was cooperation, was what the situation required, and what the Celestials would, perhaps, have recognized. She fell, whether she was truly gone, whether a being so ancient and so fundamentally connected to the Force in its most extreme expressions could be eliminated in any final sense. Luke was not certain. He said as much. He speculated that something so old and so embedded in the fabric of things might not be capable of genuine destruction the way ordinary beings are destroyed. She might return again, as she had returned so many times before during the long centuries of the Celestials' management, and then the One's management, and then the long unwatched interval that had ended when Centerpoint fell. But for now, the galaxy was safe. For now, the cycle that had been running since a mortal woman had drunk from two forbidden wells out of love and fear and desperation had reached a resting point. The Skywalker line, which had been connected to the cosmic balance since the moment Anakin stood before the Father on Mortis and refused the offer that would have changed everything, had fulfilled the responsibility that his refusal had transferred to his lineage. Luke had done, with a Sith Lord beside him, what the daughter and son had done with each other when they were still what they were meant to be. The galaxy the Celestials had built continued. The hyperspace lanes they had shaped ran in the same directions they had always run and would continue to run for as long as there were ships to travel them. The Corellian system maintained its impossible circular orbits. 5 worlds arranged with mathematical precision around their star. The planetary repulsors, still buried in the cores of each, too deep and too old and too little understood for anyone to have touched them in any meaningful way. The unknown regions remained largely unknown. The hyperspace barrier, holding the outer edges in the same configuration the Celestials had created when they decided the galaxy needed to be enclosed. Sinkhole Station, damaged by the final conflict with Abeloth, no longer functioned as it once had, but the Maw itself still existed. The black holes still in their formation. Still, the most extreme natural-seeming environment in the galaxy that was not natural at all. Most beings would live and die without ever knowing any of this. The pilots who flew the hyperspace lanes every day of their working lives did not know the lanes had been shaped. The farmers on Corellia who looked up at the strange station in the sky did not know the world they stood on had been moved. The Jedi who meditated on the Force and built entire traditions around what they believed it was and what it required of them did not know that beings had once walked the galaxy for whom all of those arguments were a description of something they felt directly, the way breathing is described rather than argued about. The not knowing is the most essential quality of the Celestials' legacy. They built everything that mattered. They maintained the balance that kept the galaxy from tearing itself apart before the Jedi could form and the Republic could rise, and the tens of thousands of years of history that produced Luke Skywalker and Anakin before him could unfold. They did all of this without leaving their names behind, without leaving anything that would allow the civilizations they seeded and placed, and managed to look back and understand what had been done for them. The ancient insect hive in the unknown regions remembered. But the Thurut did not speak to beings who had not come looking, and most beings never came looking because most beings did not know there was anything to find. They are the foundation of everything, and they are invisible. The galaxy that exists is the galaxy they designed. The force that runs through it is the force they tended. The balance the Jedi spent thousands of years trying to maintain, and the Sith spent thousands of years trying to break, was a balance the Celestials established long before either of those traditions had names. Everything that came after them happened inside the structure they left behind. They are not remembered, but they are present in everything. The galaxy sleeps under a sky full of stars they arranged.